Our summer family reunion in 2023 took place in Asheville, North Carolina. Eileen and I chose to drive, taking 4 days to make the trip. On the first day, we dropped down into the panhandle of Oklahoma and drove out to Woodward, Oklahoma. On day 2, we traversed Oklahoma, crossing into Arkansas at Fort Smith, and then continued on to Russellville in about the middle of the state. On the third day, we continued on across Arkansas and then crossed the Mississippi River into Tennessee at Memphis and continued on to Columbia, again about the middle of the state. On the final day, we traveled across eastern Tennessee and then entered North Carolina and drove on to Asheville. The first day's drive proved not to be very exciting. The highlight of the day was this picture of the bark on a tree in the picnic ground in Lamar, Colorado. Day 2 was somewhat problematic, but it was improved with a little coffee. On day 3, we crossed the Mississippi River into Memphis, which greeted us with a rather interesting pyramid. For dinner, the trip chef prepared curried chicken with yams and eggplant. Our final day gave us some interesting views of central Tennessee, a very pretty area. Here, close to McMinnville in Tennessee, we have a typical central Tennessee view of the landscape. Forested hills and very green fields. We continued on into North Carolina, where we drove on US 129, known as the Dragon because of its many twists and turns, and were photographed making one of those turns. Ultimately, we arrived in Asheville and met with the rest of the family. Meanwhile, Jen and Chaz had flown into Knoxville, Tennessee earlier in the week, where they admired the Tennessee River, and then went on to Asheville, where we see here Chaz very much admiring the large flatiron. The Shamrells flew into Asheville from Portland on the 8th of July, and from the picture it would appear that 5 out of 6 in the family had a good trip. On Saturday the 8th, Bob and Amy also flew in from Grand Junction to Asheville, and we all met at the rental house, which we see here in the hills to the east of Asheville. On Sunday the 9th, we attended Mass at the Basilica of St. Lawrence in downtown Asheville. This church boasts the largest unsupported elliptical dome in the world. And here we see that dome. And the altar beneath it. Here are some other pictures of the interior of the church. In the afternoon, we went to the not very impressive Botanic Gardens of Asheville. And in those gardens, the Chamerel children found the most photogenic scene for this picture. On July 10th, we drove south on the Blue Ridge Parkway and stopped along the way for this view of the valley below. We are at 3,750 feet, and that peak across the way is called Stony Bald. It's at 4,500 feet. Having moved along a ways, we've come to this place where you can have quite a vista going out, and then this bald mountain in front of us. Here we've reached our destination, the Art Loeb Trail to the top of Black Balsam Bald Mountain.
We just wouldn't even go together. Oh, what do we do? Well, we're not going to do that because I'm not going to hit.
And here are some pictures taken along the trail. Along the side of the trail were some pretty and fairly unique wildflowers. At this point, we're getting fairly close to the top of Black Balsam Bald. And you can see that the clouds have sort of filled in, somewhat restricting the view. And here is the remaining trail to the top. The trail became quite rocky as we approached the top, but we all managed to make it there in the end.
Like 2 inches long. There's a big bug over here.
And here are some vistas from the top. We are at the top of Black Balsam Bald at 6,250 feet. And we can look around and see the clouds below us right here. And back to the starting point. On the way back to Asheville, we detoured off the Blue Mountain Parkway to the east in order to see Looking Glass Falls, which we see here. In the evening, from the front porch of our rental house, we noticed that there was a bear down at the trash bin down by the street trying to gain entry and not really succeeding, and eventually climbing down from that trash bin and being assailed by its cub, it then left the area. The bear proved to be of some interest to Nora, as well as Em and Lucy. We took Tuesday off of strenuous activity, but on Wednesday we all drove north on the Blue Ridge Parkway to Mount Mitchell, as the sign says, the highest peak east of the Mississippi River with an elevation of 6,684 feet. It's even a little higher if you go to the viewing platform and take a look around.
That's at least 100 miles away. Way over there, below those clouds.
Of course, that's important to know.
Henry. Hi.
Hi. Daddy, I'm taking
Jackson.
a picture of you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Hello. Okay. Hey, there's no box. It doesn't feel. I want my
Clean your
From Mount Mitchell, we drove back south to Craggy Gardens, where there was a picnic area, and we all enjoyed a picnic before starting a little hike through the Craggy Gardens area. Along the trail there were several interesting looking trees, but the highlight of the trail is supposed to be wild rhododendrons. Unfortunately, the time was a little late for them, and we only saw this one. The trail also offered an opportunity to see these ranges of mountains within the Smokies. And also offered some pretty red flowers, growing in a meadow. Midway along the path there was a nice shelter which gave us a chance to rest and enjoy the view. This was our last day together, and in the evening we celebrated with toasting marshmallows, as well as doing justice to the last of the wine supply. In the morning we posed for our usual departure picture with the Shamrell children. Then Jen and Chaz left for Knoxville, the airport, and home, while the rest of us made plans for extending our trip. The Shamrells drove to Virginia to visit friends, and while there, they saw this unusual hearse. Their trip home went through Dallas, where their continuing flight was canceled, leaving James in something of a panic. However, Lucy seemed satisfied with the results, if the other kids found that things were sort of tight. Bob and Amy's trip continuation involved visiting a number of national parks in the surrounding area. Here they are at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Fog put a damper to their visit to the New River Gorge in West Virginia, but there was time in West Virginia for some refreshments at the Woodford Reserve Distillery. Here Amy's checking things out at Congaree National Park in South Carolina, and here they're enjoying some frog's legs. Eileen and I postponed our departure from North Carolina by dropping down to Hendersonville and visiting my cousin Nett, her husband Larry, and her daughter Vaughn. Our trip home from Hendersonville took 4.5 days. On the first day, we drove north through a bit of Tennessee and into Kentucky, and then stopped for the night at Campbellsville. On the second day, We wound around back roads in Kentucky and then crossed the Ohio River into Illinois and quickly in the Mississippi River into Missouri, going on to stay at Poplar Bluff, Missouri. The third day saw us driving across Missouri and then crossing over into Kansas and staying at Fort Scott, right on the border. On the fourth day, we drove clear across Kansas and stayed at Goodland, Kansas, just short of the Colorado border. Day 5 was a short day in which we drove back to Parker. On the first day of our trip back in Tennessee, we stopped near Rogersville to get this picture of Lake Cherokee. That evening in our motel, we enjoyed a dinner of Old Bay seasoned shrimp and buttered rice with specially grown tomatoes from Hendersonville provided the day before by Vonnie. On the second day of our return, we drove through a succession of back roads through Kentucky, observing some of their industry and for a while being very much inundated by a very heavy rainfall. We then crossed the Ohio River into Illinois and about a mile further along crossed the Mississippi River into Missouri. But during the mile that we were in Illinois, we stopped at Fort Defiance to see the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Come to Fort Defiance in Illinois, at the very tip of Illinois, where the Ohio River, which we're looking at here, joins with, this is the confluence of it, and the Mississippi River, which we're looking at here, and the two rivers flow together as the Mississippi out that way. Here, from the very southernmost tip of Illinois, we're looking back at the bridge that connects Kentucky, which we see across the Ohio River here, to Illinois. And this is the very tip where the confluence occurs. And now we're looking up the Mississippi River toward the bridge which links Illinois to Missouri. And here we see Eileen making her way down to the confluence point. In this picture we see a tugboat chugging down the Ohio River. And here we see a tugboat pushing an enormous barge of coal down the Mississippi, right toward the confluence. Later on, in our Poplar Bluff motel, we enjoyed a meal of sweet and sour meatballs with quinoa and brown rice, cauliflower, and some Hendersonville tomatoes on the side. On the third day of our return trip, we drove uneventfully through southern Missouri, ending the day just over the border in Fort Scott, Kansas. However, in central South Missouri, we saw this very unusual wildflower while stopped to stretch our legs at the side of the road. On day 4, as we drove toward El Dorado, Kansas, the sky in the northwest became black, and we decided that discretion being the better part of valor, we'd pull into a parking lot and wait out the storm. And we did. After the storm had passed, we drove north and looked at the remnants of the storm as it moved away from us. During the rest of the day, we observed the flatness of Kansas and the billowy clouds. At a rest stop near Alexander, Kansas, we got this sense of 2 centuries of Kansas life. The abandoned horse-drawn wagon in the foreground and the windmills in the back. Our final half-day's drive was an easy freeway jaunt to Lyman and then Colorado 86 to home. And our trip was at an end.